All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's take a minute and talk a little bit about things that you should know in preparing for exam 2. We've already done exam number 1. This is going to feel very similar. It's going to open up at 5 a.m. on Monday, which is 10/26, and it'll be open until 5 p.m. on Thursday, 10/29. So you have a bit of time in there. Anytime during the week, you can sit down and choose a time that is free from some distractions or from any distractions. And you have 50 minutes as a time limit. So whenever you do start that exam, you must be finished within that 50 minutes, right? I can tell you that the last exam, being 50 questions, seemed a little bit long, so I'm cutting 5 questions off of this one and making it only 45 questions. It's going to be multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, mainly multiple choice, right? All test questions will be from the slides, video recordings, things like that. So take a look at those. You can read through the book for extra material, but I can tell you that I'm not going to ask anything that was only from the book. However, there might be something that was mentioned in a video that may not be in the notes. That is fair game. This is just like last exam. This is going to be open notes and open book. You can use your computer if you are looking at, say, PowerPoint slides or something like that, or your notes if you take notes on your computer, but you cannot use your computer to connect to the internet to search for answers. You can't use friends or any other resources as well. This is a solo effort. It should only be you and your notes. If your notes happen to be on your computer, of course you can use it then. This is going to cover chapters 4, 5, and 6. We covered them in reverse order, meaning we started with 6, then went 5, 4. 6 was wood and plastics, 5 was metals, 4 is masonry. Just like last time, there are some calculations. Shouldn't be anything too challenging, but you might want a calculator present just to help you out with those. Make sure you don't make any small errors. So let's start with this Division 6, Chapter 6 with wood and plastics. What you should know, the first part of this wood that we talked about were general material properties of wood. Would you consider wood to be a sustainable material? Why or why not? Yes, they grow, but you do have to be very careful of how you use it. So pros and cons of using wood as far as sustainability. We have hardwoods and softwoods. What types of trees make up those types of woods? Define anisotropy, grain, hygroscopy. What do those terms mean? If you don't remember, look at the notes, but grain direction determines our strength, and also we can have changes in size due to moisture in the air. Define moisture content, fiber saturation point, equilibrium moisture content, be able to calculate the moisture content. We had a really simple equation for that. Identify the 4 types of warp. These are twisting and cupping and things like that, right? What are the 3 primary factors that we use to protect protect the wood? Continuing on with part 1, physical and mechanical properties of wood. Know that relationship between specific gravity and strength. And if specific gravity goes up, does the strength go up? You should know that. Understand why an isotropy plays a role in measuring different wood strengths. So as a reminder, this relates to the grain direction and how it does matter on which direction the grain is going for our strong direction with our woods. So of course, it plays a role because all of our woods will have a strong and a weak direction. Know that wood is strongest in compression, parallel to the grain, and bending. Know the relationship between wood strength and moisture. As moisture decreases, wood strength increases. Which affects wood strength more, moisture or temperature? There was something in this slide about that. Hint, it's moisture. Part 2, we moved on to lumber and engineering wood products. Know the difference between plain and quarter sawn wood. You know, when we're cutting the wood out of our cut down logs, what is the difference between plain and quarter sawn? They both have advantages and disadvantages. Know how to calculate board feet. Remember what a board foot is. 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 inch is a board foot. Understand seasoning and how it is marked on the lumber. So that's that part that's stamped on there, right? Know the difference between actual and nominal dimensions. Is a 2x4 really a 2x4? Not really. Know how we classify lumber and how we grade lumber and what those grades are. Know how to interpret a lumber grade mark and what information you can gather from it. I think we had like 2 or 3 or 4 slides on those, so you should be able to see those and be able to figure it out. Know how to interpret plywood grade marks. Same idea. Maybe this also has the span ratings, how far you can span based on the application, if it's a floor or a roof truss. Different bond ratings, veneer classifications, how many knots there are, remember A, B, C, things like that. Part 3, we talked about framing and shop fabricated wood, vocabulary for the components of the wooden framing systems. So no terminology for wall assemblies, roof assemblies, floor assemblies, and how to identify the components on a drawing. Do you remember what a king stud is? What about a jack stud? Things like that. Know what to check in the components. What are reasonable spacing values between my joists? Which direction joists and studs should be oriented, right? To what to look for in our connections. Know the 4 common nailing practices of wood and frame assemblies and what each one looks like so you could identify it if I showed you a picture. Then we moved on to part 4. Started with timber framing, where we talked instead of stick framing, we have the big, large timbers. How is it different, or how are the two different, and why would I choose one over the other? What about timber framing connection methods? We weren't using screws or nails anymore. Instead, we had these mortises and we had joints that were all wood on wood, right? Know the advantage to using glue lam over dimensional lumber. So glue lam, gluing the multiple pieces of dimensional lumber together to create, in essence, timber framing. Moving on to plastics, 2 primary types of plastic, know those, and also the differences between them, structural properties, thermal properties, corrosion resistance, fire resistance, and how that's different from other building materials, and also when and why we'd use some kind of modifier on our plastics to change those properties. Then we moved on to Chapter 5, Division 5, Metals. With metals, Part 1, we started with the properties and manufacturing of steel. Make sure you know the difference between iron and steel and how they're made. Well, iron is a fundamental metal, right, that we are mining to create our steel. Understand the different types of wrought steel production. Wrought is the way we're heating it up and we're forming it in some way by either extruding it, hot rolling it, or forging it. Versus cast irons. Remember cast iron? We're melting it into a molten liquidy state that we can pour into a mold. And we do that because of the amount of iron and how brittle the metal is. Know the steel's strength characteristics and know what steel must protect against. So strength characteristics mean that steel is very strong in tension, unlike concrete that we've talked about so far, or wood, right? That's why steel definitely has an advantage over those materials. What does it need to be protected against? Well, clearly it has iron in it, which can rust. So that's what we need to protect, and know methods to protect steel against that. Understand how we characterize steel by carbon content and by strength. The more carbon, the harder the steel, however, the more brittle the steel is. Know the types of structural steel shapes. So those are like our I-beams and our C-channels and things like that, right? How do we decipher their designations and how do we calculate the weights? So if I have a W6 by 12, what is the 6? That's the depth of the beam. What is the 12? That means it weighs 12 pounds per linear foot. Know that for the other shapes as well. Moving on to part 2 of metals, connecting our metal, structural metal together. There are 3 different types. Remember that with our rivets and our bolts and our welding. When would I use a welded versus a bolted connection? That's when we had the bending and we need the welded to resist the bending force. Know the difference between carbon steel and high strength bolts. Carbon steel is a lower strength bolt versus the high strength bolt for more structural applications where we need that strength. Know the difference between a shear and friction connection. Remember that when I'm bolting 2 objects together, I'm either going to rely on the bolt itself to handle the forces that the bolt doesn't shear off and make it in 2 or 3 pieces, or I'm going to tighten the bolt so much that it's friction between the plates. Those are the 2 different types of connections with these bolts. How do I ensure quality for that? With using these tension control bolts. Remember, those are breaking off when they're at the correct tension, or indicator washers, which flatten or even squirt out a little ink. Be able to decipher a basic weld symbol. Nothing too complicated on that. Maybe a fillet weld on one side, something like that. What would that look like? And we had a lot of examples in the notes, so if you're unfamiliar, take a look at the slides that talk about the weld symbols. Steel assemblies and components. This is when we're putting our steel structures together. Can you look at a steel drawing frame and interpret that information? What are advantages and disadvantages to the steel framing over something like a wood frame? Understand how basic steel components go together and be able to identify the primary components. You know, what's the difference between a joist and a column or a truss? And also know the specific structural steel shapes, which we also talked about. Know specific types of steel roof and floor decks. That was that corrugated steel we talked about before. Know the several methods of fireproofing structural steel by encasing the steel or painting the steel with a fire retardant or what you're going to do. What does it say? And the effect of having or not having fireproofing under restrictions from building codes. Basically, you can't have a real high rise if you don't have fireproofing because the fear is that you'd have a fire down below and people wouldn't be able to get down all the flights of stairs and get out. Moving on to cold formed framing. Before this, it was all structural steel, which was heated and then extruded or hot rolled or something like that. Versus cold, it's not heated at all. So it's a very thin gauge, very thin material that we can not heat but still have the ability to form it to what shapes we need, right? Now the primary shapes, we talked about the C shapes and the channels and things like that and how they're connected together and configured. Aluminum, where does aluminum come from? What is it made from? It's at that bauxite ore. How is its strength changed with alloying? Remember, alloying is adding these other metals to change the properties of the aluminum. Know the advantages and disadvantages between using steel and aluminum. We talked about some other metals, mainly copper more than anything else, but what about the properties and uses for those other metals? Metal finishes to bring on the aesthetics. What about chemical versus mechanical finishes, and what do those mean? Moving on to Division 4, Chapter 4, Masonry. Know the components of masonry with appropriate vocabulary. So what's the difference between mortar and grout, things like that? And what about a clay masonry unit versus a CMU? Know the 4 types of mortar and grout based on cementatious type. And also know the difference between mortar and grout. Remember, mortar makes it stick and grout fills the holes. And know the 4 types of mortar based on use. So that's when we had the based on strength, from greatest strength to lowest strength. I think there's 3 slides on that. When they're ideal and which mortar you'll choose for which type. Know the important plastic and hardened properties of mortar. So we're starting off with plastic. That's when we can still move it around. Then it hardens. Why do we care about each? So we're talking about workability versus strength, right? Or bond strength. Know what retempering is and why it is and isn't beneficial. So retempering is that evaporation of the water, so we need to add water. That's the retempering process, is adding that water. If you have not enough water, then you have a weak bond, and if you have too much water, then it sucks into the brick. Understand basic reinforcing, anchoring, and flashing components. Part 2, what is a clay masonry unit? What is it made from? And how is it sized? Its common physical properties that are important to performance and selection. Really, I think what we're most concerned about is how quickly it'll absorb water, right? Know what a CMU, which is a concrete masonry unit, same thing as a cinder block, is made from. Its standard size, common physical properties, what is important about its performance and selection. Know and be able to identify the 4 types of masonry walls and when each should be used. Know the grading of brick based on weathering index. Remember, that was that severe weathering, moderate weathering, negligible weathering, different based on regions of the country, and that would give you different strength properties and absorption properties of those bricks. Know the different types of reinforcing in masonry walls and how they're used. What about strategies for reducing cracking in masonry? You know, because cracking in any wall reduces its structural strength. What about the difference between arches and lintels and advantages and disadvantages of each? So arches, of course, is self-supporting based on the arch structure, versus a lintel is like usually a metal piece of iron or something that you're building off of over openings. They're both for openings, but there is a difference between those. So just knowing those words, the terminology, right? Part 3 of masonry, unit masonry construction. What's the difference between clay bricks and CMUs as far as being wetted during the construction process, meaning you're adding water to it? You add water to clay, but you don't add water to the CMU. Well, you may add water to clay. Why wouldn't you? Or when would you? Know that. Definitions of masonry placement. So we talked about row locks, stretchers, headers, all how that brick is oriented, right? Know the basic order of construction of clay brick walls and CMU walls. So you have your mortar bed, you're starting on the corners, you're working your way in. You have your story pole, you have your chalk line to get your elevation, right? Know the difference between a troweled and tooled joints. Troweled joints, you're just using your trowel and you're basically either creating a smooth face along the bricks for that mortar joint, or you're just taking the trowel and tooling it in a certain way. Shouldn't say the word tooled, because a tooled joint is using the tools to create either a concave or a V, something like that, right? Know the difference and purpose of parging and damp proofing. Both those are to keep water out. Parging is like a whole exterior surface that you're doing with concrete or mortar, versus damp proofing is a painting on of a bituminous tar-like paint surface, right? What about pointing, filling in those holes in your brick, and cleaning off your brick with like a stiff brush or pressure washing or an acid solution? What other masonry systems? We only talked about 2 other masonry systems. One was the glass block and the other one was a stone. What type of mortar is used in glass masonry? So you can just look up that as well. So that's what I have. As usual, reach out to me. Look through all of your notes. Get organized is probably the #1 piece of advice that I could give you. Be familiar with where everything is within your notes so you can look it up on the fly. Good luck. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, and I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks.